So we're talking the Bengals who fell off, but, still went 9-8. They were still, I think they survived late in the season with Jake Browning pretty well. So that's, again, going to make this a more interesting conversation. But before we talk about who's going to be this year's Bengals, a playoff team that maybe doesn't reach those expectations, let's talk about what happened to last year's Bengals. Of course, Joe Burrow injuries, the calf in the preseason, then eventually the wrist. Those are the obvious ones, Frank. And if you want to kind of expand on Burrow and kind of where he stands at this point, that's fine. But what other issues did the Cincinnati Bengals face last year that made them fall off from a Super Bowl contender to a 9-8, like we survived the season type of campaign?
Yeah, and I think, I just wrote the Bengals preview that's going to be coming up. It hasn't published yet. But in writing that, basically the lead I had was that years from now, we're going to look back and say, oh, the Bengals missed the playoffs during the Joe Burrow era. That's because he got hurt and nothing else. When that really was not the truth. A lot of things went wrong for the Bengals last year. And then just the knockout blow was Joe Burrow's wrist injury. And it started, early in training camp when Joe Burrow hurt his calf, missed all of August. And when he came back, he just couldn't move. You could see it. And the offensive line really got exposed. That was not a good line. Burrow couldn't move to get out of the way. The offense had nothing going downfield because he couldn't buy any time for himself to get the ball downfield. T. Higgins became a ghost in the offense. And all of this could be related to the calf. But I also hesitate to just put it completely on a preseason injury. And then obviously the wrist injury that happened in November. It was the defense fell apart. That has nothing to do with Joe Burrow's wrist, right? Or his calf. The defense could not stop the run at the end of the year. They really, really struggled. They've never been a great defense, but they've always been more competitive than they were at that time in the season. And, the crazy thing is, we would just like to think that, they fell apart when Joe Burrow went out of the lineup for the rest of the season. I think people would be shocked to know that in terms of, these are the cherry picking stats, PFF grade and passer rating, Jake Browning was better than Joe Burrow last year. I think that's a little troubling. That this guy who we all know is a star really did not play well when he played. Now, if you want to blame it all on the preseason injury, I'm fine with that because I love Joe Burrow. I think he's a superstar. I think he's going to be a superstar going forward. But yeah, we have to examine that a little bit. This wasn't a team that fell apart with Jake Browning. They actually played pretty well with Jake Browning. Browning played pretty well himself. I'm surprised he didn't get more attention in the offseason as far in his free agency. So we have to look at everything that went wrong with the Bengals. Why T. Higgins disappeared. Why the offensive line just kind of really, really got exposed last year. Why the defense fell apart, which obviously has nothing to do with the quarterback. And it all kind of came together for the Bengals where they just, like you said, it just one thing happened, like the Jenga analogy, and it just all crumbled for them. Now, real quick, before I throw it back to you, our NFL editor, Joey Galino, pointed out to me privately, he said, don't forget that game against the 49ers. The Bengals were getting hot in the middle of the season, and they went to San Francisco and just destroyed completely outplayed the 49ers in a win there. One of the most impressive wins all year. So maybe there is something to be said about, if Joe Burrow stays healthy the rest of the year, maybe they go on and make the playoffs anyway. But yeah, a really, really strange year for the Bengals.
Yeah, I think they could have been the final seed ahead of the Steelers, right? Or something like that.
Sure, they're a better team than the Steelers probably. At that point, when the moment Joe Burrow got hurt on that primetime game against the Ravens, they were a better team than the Steelers. They were one of the 12 best teams in the NFL for sure.
Absolutely. So yeah, it's I think that the easy thing to say is that had Burrow stayed healthy the rest of the way, maybe we don't care about how he started the season, because I think one of the most prescient things I read week 1 last year, week 2 last year was Derek Klassen breaking down Joe Burrow's film and basically saying I don't know who's wearing number 9 for the Bengals right now, but it's not Joe Burrow. And that was just the way it felt watching him early in the season. So, but again, I want to come back to the offense because you brought the defensive point up, and I think that is the biggest thing that people forget about that team last year, that maybe they were never one of the best defenses in the NFL, but Lou Anarumo was pitching heat during their Super Bowl run, their run to face the Rams in 21. And then if you look back at 2022, they were 7th in defensive success rate and they were 8th in EPA per play allowed. Spin that to last year, they're 27th and 31st, 27th in EPA, 31st in success rate. So that is a huge cataclysmic fall. And a lot of that comes back to, this is a team that spent a lot of resources on the offensive line. They spent a lot of resources, obviously building up the offense. And then they made a lot of like, in a weird way, we typically think like, oh, you don't build a defense or you don't build a team in free agency, but they had built that team and that defense, especially mostly through free agents. And then once they had to start paying Burrow and obviously then some more on the offensive side, and again, still spending on tackles like Orlando Brown, you start drafting guys to maybe step up, Dax Hill, you take some of these guys like Miles Murphy, and those guys like weren't contributors really last year. They weren't plus starters. That I think is actually the big, you let a guy like Jesse Bates walks to Atlanta, has a great year in Atlanta. That's a big difference. Von Bell's in Carolina. He's actually back there now, but that's what's so interesting, I think, about this Bengals team is that they hit some home runs on the offensive side of the ball on the draft. They haven't done that in the defense yet. I think that has been the biggest difference between sort of the Bengals of 21 and 22, and then obviously the Bengals we got last year, beyond the fact that their quarterback wasn't healthy.
Right. And sometimes a change that we don't make a lot out of ends up being a pretty big deal, like the safeties last year with the Bengals. You talked about Jesse Bates, who had a really, really good year in Atlanta, but also Von Bell. Like you said, he left, and their safety play was abysmal last year. So they go back. They get Von Bell right back. That he's obviously fit, knows the scheme really well. They also signed Geno Stone from coming off a great year with the Ravens. So maybe that fixes that issue. We don't think a lot of safeties right in the offseason. We're talking all these previews. We don't, oh, yeah, they lost this safety. Like, it's just not something that's on our radar, but that made a big difference for the Bengals, who, one of the stats I really like to lean on, it's a very simple one. It's yards per play differential. It's simple. How many yards per play do you get on offense? How many do you give up on defense? The Bengals were 30th in the NFL in that category last year. That leads me to believe that was a bad football team. And again, if Jake Browning was just abysmal, he was the Jets, backup quarterbacks, Tim Boyle and all that, but he wasn't. He was pretty good. Yeah. So we have to dig into, well, they were the third worst team in the NFL in this very telling stat. Does that mean something going forward? Does that mean the Bengals are going to bounce right back? Or is that kind of telling to say, hey, these defensive issues might not be fixed and the offensive ones might not either?